Jimmy said a name. Helen Mirren's face completely changed. She stopped mid-sentence and asked, "How do you know that name?" After that moment, nothing went as planned. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studios 6A at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. Another Thursday night, another packed audience. Another A-list celebrity sitting across from Jimmy, ready to promote their latest project and share a few laughs with America before bedtime. Dame Helen Mirren, legendary actress, Oscar winner, one of the most respected performers in the world, sat in the guest chair looking elegant and poised as always. She was there to talk about her new film, a historical drama where she played a queen navigating political intrigue in 18th century Europe. The interview was going perfectly. Jimmy had her laughing about stories from the set. The audience was engaged. The Roots were playing subtle background music. Everything was smooth, professional, exactly what millions of viewers expected from The Tonight Show. Jimmy glanced at his Blue Note card, reading the next pre-written question from his producers. "So, in the film, your character has this incredibly complex relationship with her advisor, and I read that you based some of that dynamic on a real person from your past. Can you tell us about that?" It was a softball question. The kind of prompt designed to let Helen share an interesting anecdote, maybe get a little vulnerable, give the audience a glimpse behind the curtain of her creative process. Helen smiled, settling into her answer. "Well, yes, actually. When I was much younger, just starting out in theater, I had a director who..." Jimmy, trying to be helpful, glanced at his card again and interjected with the name his researchers had found. "Was this David Morrison? Because I read that he was really influential in your early career." Helen stopped speaking. Her smile vanished. Her entire body went rigid. The studio felt the shift immediately. The Roots' music seemed to fade. The audience's pleasant murmur died. Jimmy noticed her reaction, and his own smile faltered. "I'm sorry. What did you just say?" Helen's voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried through the entire studio with devastating clarity. Jimmy looked confused. "David Morrison? Your early theater director? I thought. How do you know that name?" Helen interrupted, her hand rising in a stopping gesture. "How do you know David Morrison?" Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. Jimmy's note cards slipped from his fingers, one falling to the floor. He leaned forward, suddenly very aware that something had gone terribly wrong, but having no idea what our research team put together background on your career. "We found articles mentioning him as one of your early influences." "I thought it would be nice to." "What articles?" Helen's voice was sharp now, not angry but intense. "Where did you find that name?" Jimmy glanced toward his producer standing just off stage who looked equally confused. I can get you the specific sources." "Helen, I'm sorry. Did I say something wrong?" Helen's hand was trembling. She gripped the armrest of her chair tightly and Jimmy could see tears beginning to form in her eyes. This wasn't embarrassment. This wasn't annoyance at an awkward question. This was something much deeper. "That name," Helen said slowly, each word careful and measured, "hasn't been spoken on television in 47 years. I haven't heard anyone say it out loud, and I can't even remember how long." The audience was completely silent. 300 people holding their collective breath. The cameras kept rolling, operators unsure whether to cut away or keep filming. The control room was chaos. The director shouting questions into headsets. Producers scrambling to figure out what was happening. Jimmy's entire demeanor changed. The host persona disappeared, replaced by genuine human concern. "Helen, I'm so sorry. I clearly touched on something I shouldn't have. We can cut this." "We can." "No," Helen said firmly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "No, don't cut it. I think maybe this is supposed to happen." She took a deep breath, composing herself, and looked directly at Jimmy. "David Morrison was my first love, and he died 47 years ago. And I've never talked about him publicly because it was too painful and too private, and I didn't think the world needed to know." Jimmy sat very still, his training as an interviewer telling him to just listen, to give her space. "But you just said his name." Helen continued, her voice thick with emotion. "And I think that's a sign. So, I'm going to tell you who he was. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who David Morrison was. And more importantly, you need to understand what he meant to a young actress named Helen Lydia Minoff before the world knew her as Helen Mirren." 1967, London. The Royal Shakespeare Company. Helen was 22 years old, just beginning her career, filled with raw talent and ambition, but still learning, still finding her voice as an actor. David Morrison was 31, an assistant director with the company, not famous, not powerful, but brilliant in his own way. He understood theater with an almost mystical intuition, could see layers in a performance that others missed, could guide actors to depths they didn't know they possessed. He'd been assigned to work with Helen on a small production of Troyes and Crisa. She was playing Crisa, her first significant role with the company. She was terrified of failing, of proving that her audition had been a fluke, of not being good enough for the legendary RSC. David had pulled her aside after the first rehearsal. "You're trying too hard," he'd said bluntly. "You're performing instead of being. Stop showing us how good you think you need to be and just exist in the character." Helen had been insulted at first. Who was this assistant director to criticize her? But he'd been right. Over the weeks of rehearsal, David had worked with her privately, breaking down her defenses, challenging her assumptions, pushing her to a level of vulnerability and truth she hadn't known she was capable of. They'd fallen in love somewhere in that process. Not the explosive, dramatic kind of love. The quiet kind. The kind where you realize one day that you can't imagine doing this work, living this life without the other person beside you. David had dreams beyond assistant directing. He wanted to start his own theater company someday, focused on new works by unknown playwrights. He talked about it constantly. The kind of space it would be, the kinds of stories they tell, how Helen would be his leading lady, how they'd build something meaningful together. "We're going to change theater," he'd say, lying beside her in his tiny flat after rehearsals. "You and me, we're going to prove that truth matters more than spectacle." Helen believed him. She believed in him. She believed in them. The production of Troyes and Crisa was a success. Helen's performance was noted in reviews, her first real professional recognition. David was proud beyond words. They celebrated with cheap wine and big dreams. 2 weeks later, David Morrison died. A brain aneurysm. Sudden, unpredictable, devastating. He was 31 years old. One moment he was alive, brilliant planning their future. The next moment he was gone. Helen was 22 and heartbroken in a way she didn't have words for. She couldn't process it, couldn't grieve properly because they'd kept their relationship private. Theater was a small world, and there were rules about relationships within companies, especially with the age difference. So Helen mourned alone. She went to his funeral and sat in the back. She packed up the few things he'd left at her apartment. She took the heartbreak and buried it so deep that she could continue working, continue auditioning, continue building the career David had believed she would have. She never spoke about him publicly. In interviews over the decades, when journalists asked about her early influences, she would mention the RSC, the productions, the roles, but never David Morrison. That grief, that love, that loss remained locked away. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Back in Studio 6A, Helen Mirren had just finished telling this story to Jimmy Fallon and 300 strangers and millions of viewers at home. Tears were streaming down her face. Jimmy had tears in his eyes, too. "I'm so sorry," Jimmy said quietly. "I had no idea. Our researchers never would have." "It's all right," Ellen said, wiping her eyes and actually smiling a little. "It's been 47 years. Maybe it's time I said his name out loud again. Maybe it's time people knew about the man who taught me everything I know about being truthful in my work." She paused, looking directly into the camera. David Morrison. His name was David Morrison. And if you've ever seen me in anything and thought I'd brought truth to a performance, that's because of him. That's his legacy. Living through my work all these years. The audience erupted in applause. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the reverent applause of people witnessing something sacred. People were standing, crying, honoring a man they never heard of until 5 minutes ago. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy stood up from his chair. He walked over to his desk, not to get a prop or a gag for a comedy bit, but to open a drawer. He pulled out a leather-bound notebook, the kind he used to jot down ideas for the show, thoughts, moments he wanted to remember. He walked back to Helen and sat down beside her, not across from her, breaking the interview format completely. Making this a conversation between two humans, not a host and a guest. "Helen," he said, "I write in this notebook every day. Ideas, observations, things my daughters say that make me laugh. Things I want to remember." He handed it to her. "Would you write his name in here? David Morrison. So I never forget him either. So his name lives on." Helen looked at the notebook, then at Jimmy, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She took the pen Jimmy offered and opened to a blank page. In elegant handwriting, she wrote, David Morrison, 1936 to 1967. He taught me that truth is the only thing worth pursuing in art. Helen Mirren, The Tonight Show, 2024 inches. She handed the notebook back to Jimmy, who looked at the page and nodded. Thank you, he said quietly. I'll keep this forever. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Helen reached into her purse, a small clutch she'd brought on stage. She pulled out a folded piece of paper yellowed with age, the creases worn from being folded and unfolded countless times over decades. I've carried this with me for 47 years, she said, her voice barely steady. David wrote it to me the night before he died. He had no idea, of course. It was just a note he left on my door after he walked me home from rehearsal. She unfolded the paper carefully, treating it like the precious artifact it was. I've never shown this to anyone, but I think he'd want people to know he existed, that his words mattered. She read aloud, her voice breaking. My darling Helen, remember tonight when you doubted yourself during that scene, and I told you to stop thinking and start feeling? You did it. You stopped performing and started being. That's when you become magic. Don't ever forget that you have magic inside you. And don't ever let anyone tell you that truth doesn't matter. It's all that matters. I love you. See you tomorrow, David. The studio was silent except for the sound of people crying. Not just the audience, the camera operators, the producers, the roots. Even the security guards standing by the exits had tears streaming down their faces. Jimmy couldn't speak. He just reached over and took Helen's hand. And they sat there together for a moment while 300 people and millions watching at home witnessed something television rarely captures. Grief finally spoken. Love finally honored. A name finally remembered. Helen carefully refolded the note and placed it back in her purse. Thank you, Jimmy, she said, for accidentally saying his name, for giving me permission to remember him out loud. Jimmy wiped his eyes. Thank you for trusting us with his story. The audience stood not for applause, but in respect for David Morrison, for Helen, for love that survives death. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. After the show, Jimmy had the page from his notebook professionally preserved. It hangs in his office beside photos of his family. Helen's words about David Morrison written in her own hand. Helen says that interview changed something in her. She talks about David now in other interviews. Mentions him by name, honors his influence openly. The grief she carried alone for 47 years is lighter now that it's shared. And Jimmy Fallon learned that sometimes the best interviews happen when you accidentally ask exactly the wrong question. David Morrison's name lives on because someone finally said it out loud again.